this is the future us. From an hour later, that we forgot to say, subscribe this, you freaking beautiful person, you, and like and comment. We're gonna warp back into our squad.
Kind of leads us to one of our next questions too. Is like from your perspective, and as far as from Miamians, and as like being in Cuba, are the sanctions, the American sanctions, and the American embargo, is that as damning as kind of we think so? I mean, like, what does it actually look like on the inside? We having never been to Cuba, only have the outside perspective and the historical perspective of what those sanctions and what that embargo has done to Cuba over the last 70 years or 70 odd years or whatever. What does it actually look like from the inside? Is it as damning and is it as destructive as kind of we would think, like the actual rural areas of Cuba?
I will say this much, coming from comparing to like what I saw Cuba to, the many times I've been to like Haiti and stuff like that. As a person who's seen like the conditions of Haiti with like it's very destructive with like gang territories and like the government corruption, what Cuba's doing currently now with the sanctions, it's bad. And obviously you do see people suffering, but you don't see as much poverty. I don't know, maybe Joey would disagree with me with this, but I didn't see as much work. Like I saw people still striving. I still saw like food still being passed out. I saw people like still getting on with their lives and stuff like that. Like obviously, like it's still bad. It's not like you still saw like I didn't see as much suffering as I was led on to believe. Right, like there's able to do very much with very little. I don't know what would Joey. I don't know what would you say about that?
I'm gonna hold on to that like last point you said, doing very much with very little. And start with saying that a lot of people have this argument, right, or debate. It's not a blockade, blah 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 blah. It's not a physical one, but it's an economic one, right? And that's because the level, the intensity of the sanctions against Cuba are entirely restrictive. I mean, like the options they have as a country to survive are inhumane, and you can't work with them, right? And so that's why they call it a blockade. And I have another Cuban friend who left. He actually left when he was around 13 or so. So he has an even better lived in Cuba and is a communist kind of perspective on these things. But and I've heard this before, but he calls the blockade genocidal, and I finally understood that when I was in there. Because the blockade is made with the intent to starve the Cuban people, to make them suffer, with the intent, right? Like people have died because of the blockade. With COVID, Cuba was denied respirators and oxygen and things like that, whether through the country that I was coming from not being able to trade, or because one of the laws is that if a product has 10% or more parts from the U.S., it's not entering Cuba. So with all the sanctions and all the suffering that the U.S. has caused onto Cuba, they saw that people needed these respirators and the oxygen and things like that, or the ventilators, and they still denied them. They denied them syringes and stuff like that. People on their deathbeds, the medicine that they needed to survive died. I mean, it brings a tear to my eye. It really does. And that's just one perspective. We're so actually collecting our notes on how many different ways the blockade affects Cuba, right? With finances, they're not able to take loans. They have to, or they're not able to pay things on credit, so they have to pay for things with the cash they have on hand, which is obviously restricted, being a former, basically like U.S. neo colony. And then, they once they nationalized companies, a lot of people pulled out. A lot of white collar people left. There was terrorism from the U.S. on the island. All these sorts of things. Cuba did not have a good start as a socialist country, and they haven't been able to have the chance they had to develop and thrive the way we want to see them thrive.
I want to ask too, because there's also, it's in addition to just the actual economic blockade. I mean, America keeps Cuba on the state sponsor of terrorism list, which is a huge, like that's another part of this conversation that also limits Cuba and what they can do internationally, like when requesting aid, or like I think their power in the UN. It's just because there's only like 4 countries on the list. It's like Iran, Syria, North Korea, and Cuba. That America keeps Cuba on that list.
Keep Cuba on that list, but they just remove them from the countries that don't, or the countries that cooperate against counterterrorism. I don't know if I'm doing the double negative right, but it's
Yeah.
essentially U.S. policy says that they are cooperating with counterterrorism, but they're also on the state's monster terrorism list. Like it's entirely counterintuitive. It's hypocritical. It doesn't make any sense. And it's just a product of like a ruling class doing whatever they fuck they want to uh, to push down a socialist country because I forget who says it, but because I think it's because they're afraid of a good example, the threat of a good example, right? And going back to what Giovanni said, Cuba is not a country that we can look at with our you know our developed country, our imperial core, our first world country, if you like saying that. I not not everyone's favorite. Our lens, right? Our standard, right? Okay, they don't have like all the luxuries that we do, but when you compare them to the rest of Latin America, when you compare them to what they were before the revolution, Cuba does a lot with so little. And I think it's because of their socialist economy and their socialist governance that's allowed them to do so this far.
Another
So
thing
yeah, it's
sorry, go on.
no, yeah, I just wanted to wrap up like on the note of the blockade. Like it's absolutely damning. It's criminal. It's genocidal. Um, do the Cuban people still make by? Yes, pretty in a pretty manner, not necessarily, but the fact that they are doing so and all the conditions they have in this country, the revolutionary spirit, the medical advancements they've made, the type of governance, the democratic features that they have, it's a spectacle. And so with that being said, they do so much with so little. So just imagine if the blockade was lifted. Imagine if they had the resources of the United States. I mean, we'd be looking at an entirely different and I thought it was already an entirely different world, but we would be there would be no words to describe it, simply put.
Utopia.
I don't like that. As a communist, I don't like that word, but yes.
But one thing I wanted to add was compared to Cuba, let's say to something like DR, right? I went to DR for like a week of vacation, right? And I went to like the downtown area. They have like infrastructure, they have like buildings that are very much like sponsored by like funded by like America Corporation, stuff like that, like your KFCs, your Domino's and shit like that. And I go into these businesses and everybody looks fucking miserable and sad as hell. It's pretty much like Diet Miami, just how like everything's still like a neoliberal hell in like DR. And when you get to Cuba, there's no fucking propaganda, there's no product placement whatsoever. It's basically I know Cuba is being told like, oh, it's a place stuck in time, but it really much is. Like, you go there, you get the feeling of the island and the community of those people. And you're less for like the whole time in Cuba, I have really bad anxiety. Every time I'm in Cuba, when I was in Cuba this whole time, it was gone. Like I just felt like a calm sense to it, what do you say, just a peaceful mindset, just like, oh, nobody's gonna kick my back, nobody's trying to like stab me in the back, nobody's trying to like betrayal and stuff like that, compared to like what you get in like other like developing countries, or even like stuff like other Caribbean nations. So Cuba is a very unique place that I don't think any other country can compare to.
Yeah. And one more thing, I had a comrade from my YDSA chapter. Actually, she went on the DSA delegation to Cuba in October, and she said she saw more homeless people on the streets in LA than she did in Havana. It's
I don't,
like
I don't doubt
it's
that for a
like
second. I mean, there's certainly more in
yeah,
Seattle
and
than
it's
anywhere.
look, they're not living in nice homes, but they fucking have one. They don't
Yeah.
have a Snickers with every meal, but they fucking have a meal.